Welcome to Radical Engagement here at Farm Blog. And to live up to my reputation as sort of the doomsayer of the left, uh, part of the four horsemen of the black pill, so to speak, even though I'm not a black pillist at all. In fact, I think that's a silly concept. And my aim is to get people to look realistically at where they're at so we can realistically do something about it. But nonetheless, like me, Danny Besner, who I often disagree with, but I really love, Benjamin Studebaker, who I disagree with, but also I'm fond of, um, and maybe Phil Nill, are kind of the Dr. No's of the left wing. And I really want people to look at working class men right now. I'm not going to get into the classes of masculinity or of gender. Those are relevant. Those are highly relevant in social reproduction. And I think that to wave them off is to be unserious. But I do think we need to look just at the material reality of working class men in America. And unfortunately, I don't go to Marxists for that right now, even though their definition of working class are usually closer to mine. They're not that interested in presenting their material conditions, aka the empirical evidence, for the stuff that they want to critique. And in fact, for many of them, this is considered irrelevant, such as reality being not particularly relevant to them. But nonetheless, you can hear my frustration when I talk about this right now. I have to go to Richard Reeves, member of the Brookings Institute, centrist as they get, who writes on men and boys in a sociologically responsible manner. And I want to talk about it because I think it holds implication for us and what we see right now, including the ways young men are being politicized. Why? Why the left doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it, despite the fact you would think, given our thesis about proletarianization, that this would be the exact moment to do so, and why this leads to so much lumpenization in a lot of working class men. In some ways, it feels like today, if you're part of the working class, you're either being lumpenized or professionalized. You either need credentials for jobs that didn't used to need them, although that is slowly ending just from the realities of the population, or you need something completely different and fresh. Or you're just being lumpenized and increasingly gigified, and maybe even in an informal economy, are one of the 10% of men between 25 and 44 that doesn't work. Many of whom may be stay-at-home dads, but all of whom are definitely not. So, let's get into it. And let's make this a little bigger so you can maybe follow along a little better. All right. Richard Reeves. Working class men, a troubling update. I am near obsessive about the need to bring both class lens and race lens to my work on boys and men. It's not possible to understand what's really going on from inside the bubble of upper middle class America. Absolutely. Most upper middle class Americans, and not even given the bourgeoisie, don't really interact with regular working class boys unless they're teachers or nurses or something most of the time. In fact, teachers and nurses are not increasingly upper middle class, but just middle class in the liberal conceptions. Now, for those of us who are Marxist, you know that middle class is not about, as far as it's not about your wage earning material, but where you are in the mode of production. But we're not going to get too technical in that. We know that we have different definitions from liberals here. That's why there were such a strong themes in my books of boys and men, recently seen on Barack Obama's recommended reading list. Thank you, Mr. President. Not dealing with an anti-liberal here, but he's got some things that are going to make liberals uncomfortable. But also why they guide the work of the American Institute for Boys and Men. To mark Labor Day, AIBM has just published a data-rich report, The State of Working Class Men. There's some deeply worrying trends in here, and even I was shocked by some of the findings. And I thought I knew this stuff pretty well. I provide some insights, lowlights really here. Yeah, we're going to go through this and not the original report, but I'm going to put a link to both this and the original report, although it's in here too, in the footnotes, because I think it's really important. But I urge you to look at the whole paper. And of course, share with others what you think you might find useful. As you see, in some cases, the class gap is much bigger than the gender gap and vice versa. But overall, the picture is clear. Working class men, now we get the definition here, which is those without four-year college degrees, which would not be all the working class, but let's just say the blue-collar working class, have been getting a sharp end of the stick on most fronts. Absolutely, they have. I've seen it in my own family. One thing I want to emphasize up front is that the racial aspect of all this, let's be honest, the term working class and middle class are often coded as white. That's unfortunate because the working class is actually much more racially diverse than the non-working class. Yes, it is. But it can't be presented as one race at all. In fact, as our new report shows, white men account for only half of the male working population, which is what you'd about expect, actually. Working class men are more diverse than the general population. Share of prime age men by race and class group 2022. Let's look at this here. I'm going to describe this for the visually impaired or for those who are just listening. We have two pie charts. We see white is 51% of the working class men. Hispanic is 26%. Black is only 14%. That's lower than I would have thought it was. I thought it would have been around 18%. So there's a lot of black men who are in prison and thus out of the working class as far as this is concerned. Asian men are tiny, and other in combination are about 5. It's interesting that this is so small they don't even really put it on here. Asian men as part of the blue collar working class. I'm going to use that to be clarifying, but know that when I refer to blue collar working class and Reeves refers to working class, we're referring to the same thing. Right, non-working class, which could be both professional working class or other. 64% white, which is more than the population, whereas the other is less than the population. 11% Hispanic, massive downgrade. 8% black, that's higher than I would have thought. 12% Asian, and 5% other in all combination. So policies to help working class men are just as likely to help men of color as to help white men. Take that. Those CRT people have said that we shouldn't fix poverty because it was not racial. It's almost as if race, class, and gender all matter, isn't it? Yeah, who knew? I don't know who else has been saying that forever. As Nick Hillman and Nicholas Robinson say, UK education researchers, right? Quote, policy making is not a zero-sum game in which you choose between caring about female disadvantage or socioeconomic gap and male underachievement. All three matter. Well, it's not supposed to be a zero-sum game, but most people sure as fuck treat it as one. But anyway, working class men die more. Health is really on my mind right now. Mine too, as I've had some health scares lately. And even me with decent insurance, and I have decent insurance thanks to my partner. I don't actually get it from being a teacher, believe it or not. We don't get good insurance anymore, at least not in my district. See my Washington Post op-ed on the topic from last week if you missed it. No, we're not going to go there. I've written about here before, but to think if writing of men and boys now, I'd have a whole chapter on it. In our new report are some pretty striking findings. Mortality rates are much higher for working class men at all ages. It really stunned me to realize that young working class men aged 25 to 34 are more likely to die than middle-aged non-working class men aged 45 to 54. That's fucking depressing. And even I didn't know that. In my studying of the decline of life expectations, that's not a stat I've seen before. Working class men much more likely to die across age groups. I'm going to describe this for the people who are listening or visually impaired. Death rates per 100,000 for prime age men and women, 2022. We're not even dealing with it now. It's probably worse in 2024. Working class men, non-working class men, working class women, non-working class women. All right. And this is per 100K. So 18 to 34-year-old working class men, 324,000 deaths. So 324 per 100,000 death rate for working class men, 43 for working class women, 154 for non-working class men, 28 for non-working class women. And we can see here that men die like 4 times what women do young, but that there's a more than double difference between working class and non-working class. 34 to 44-year-olds, oh my God. 458 per 100,000. Now remember, when I report normal deaths, it's like 6 per 100,000 for murder or 8 per 100,000 for murder, so this is a lot. I mean, but we're talking about all deaths in aggregate. 95 per 100,000 for working class women, 250 per 100,000, 258 per 100,000 for non-working class women, and 64 for non-working class men. And the ratios are basically the same in all age groups here. And we'll get to the last age group, that's 45 to 54. And this is still, we're not getting into when we expect people to die, people. So 55 to 54-year-olds, and I feel this, 739 per 100,000, whereas 205 per 100,000 for working class women, 458 per 100,000 for non-working class men, 149 per non-working class women. Figures show death rate per 100,000 per 10-year age groups, prime age, 25 to 54 years old, men and women. Death by age group, sex, and working class status in 2022 were collected by the CDC mortality data. Population counts for each subgroup in 2022 were collected from the 2022 ACS via IPUMS. I don't know what that means. Men and women without at least a bachelor's degree are classified as working class. Again, they're using the educational definition. Deaths without a determinate working class status were removed from all counts. So we're not talking about who we don't know. Why? For one thing, working class men face alarmingly high risk from deaths of despair, such as suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related deaths. That's always been more for men. It's always been more for the working class. But that's actually not historically true in America before the 1970s. If you read Werner Sombart talking about Europeans in the 19th century versus Americans, you actually see the opposite trend. All right. I'm aware this is from the case in Denton as it's falling out of favor, and for some good reasons. I don't know what they are. I'll look it up. But I think it remains useful shorthand. Rates have always been slightly higher for working class men, but the gap has simply exploded in the last 3 decades. Deaths of the stair per 100,000 for prime age working men. This is a chart for those of you who are visually impaired or just listening. And women, 1991 to 2002. And we see an increase of 60 per 100,000 for deaths of the stair to 180 for 100,000 working class men. We see 20 to just under 40 per 100,000 for non-working class men. We see 19 roughly to 680 per 100,000 for working class women. And non-working class women are pretty static at like less than 5 to like slightly up to like almost 20 per 100,000. It's worth digging a bit more, however. It turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, that drugs are the main story here. In 2022, the death rate from drug overdoses for working class men were 9 times as high as for men with bachelor's degree. Not that they do less drugs, but they are more likely to die for them. Deaths of despair for 100,000 for prime working age men and women. And we see here the ratios are even higher, uneven than before. So whereas the deaths of despair, whereas female deaths in aggregate are always lower than male deaths, even working class women compared to non-working class men, we do not see this trend here. We see a different trend where working class women are way more likely to die than of deaths of despair than non-working class women. And again, we're defining non-working class as college educated, so blue collar working class here. And the numbers are astronomical for blue collar men. And we see this from drugs. Drugs is the biggest culprit. We see an increase from alcohol, but in more predictable proportions. And we see an increase in suicide where men outnumber women. We've seen an increase in female suicide in general, particularly with younger women. This is not in this report, but I just happen to know that. But we see, again, the highest amongst working class men. But the drug overdoses is the biggest killer of young working class men, from deaths of despair, anyway. I don't know. It might be the biggest cure, period. I don't know. As we write in the report, quote, death from alcohol-related causes and suicide are about 3 times as high for working class men as for non-working class counterparts. Notably, working class women are generally more vulnerable to deaths of despair than both men and women who are not working class. Suicide is the only cause of death where non-working class men are more at risk than working class women. That's basically what I conclude too from looking at that data as presented there. The health gap shows up as an employment gap. Working class men are in fact far less likely to be working than non-working class men. Now, from my perspective, if you're not working, from a Marxist perspective, if you're not working, you're in the reserve army of labor, so you're in the kind of in the working class, but you're also kind of lumpenized, which is what I mean by lumpenization. Lumpenization is no longer just for people who fell out of the other classes, as in Marxist time. It is extended up through the industrial and service sector working class, aka the blue collar working class. And if we do not deal with that, we are not helping shit. All right. That means dealing with drugs. And I don't mean by just making them illegal. All right. That doesn't work, nor does just legalizing them. You can't just pretend that law is the only problem here. All right. Working class men are in fact less likely to be working than non-working class men. So there's people who don't have a job or who don't have a degree are less likely to have work. So less likely to be steadily part of what the Marxists would consider part of the working class because they're in and out of it constantly, which kind of hurts a lot of narratives about the working class on the Marxist left. But we'll come back to that. But in some ways, what is even more telling is the difference with the reasons why they are not. Half of working class men not in work, 52%, say it's because of illness or disability, compared to just 18% of non-working class men. I'm going to highlight this. They're either lying or this is a bigger deal than I normally hear. Half of working class men are not in work, say this is because of illness or disability, compared to 18% of non-working class men. Men with college degrees are more likely to be out of work because they are pursuing yet more education. That's 24% of non-working college white-collar men. Poor health, main reasons working class men are not employed. Bam. All right. So 52% say it's ill or disabled. 13% say taking care of home and family, as opposed to 70% of women. That's 18% of women who are not working say they're disabled. So we have a big increase of men in the working class who are taking care of children now, or other spousal members. That's 13% probably way higher than its historical norm. I don't really know the historical norm off the top of my head, so I might have to look that up. 9% are retired. 19% of women are retired. 9% say they can't find work. Only 7%. So there's very few people are saying they can't work because they're not finding work. 9% of men say other, 15% of men say whether, and 8% of working class men say they're not working for going back to school, versus 24% of working class women. So working class women still see education as a way out of their situation. Working class men do not, at least according to the stats. Now, we'd have to do more ethnography to really know that, but it's something we should consider. Working class men are also more vulnerable to other health challenges, including workplace injuries and chronic diseases. Maybe it's kind of obvious, but I was still blown away by the fact that workplace deaths are basically a macabre monopoly of working class men. Well, duh. Particularly if you're talking about blue-collar working class men. Occupational death rate per 100K for prime age men and women. It's people between the ages of 25 and 55. So 5.3 per 100,000, which is less than the murder rate, but it's pretty close. Whereas non-working class men, it's 1.5 per 100,000 versus working class women, it's 0.05 per 100,000, and non-working class women, it's 0.02. Family and friends. This is not surprising, but it's a bummer. And this is true for all social classes, but it's really true. I wasn't surprised by the coin glass cap and marriage because it was a theme of my work at Brookings. But I'm not sure that it's well understood outside of the wonk sphere, and I haven't really clocked the gender dimension before. But here's the share of who have ever been married by age 40. So 84% of non-working class women have been married by age 40. 80% of non-working class men have been married at least once by age 40. This is not dealing with divorces and shit. Working class women, 73% have been married by age 40, but only 67% of working class men have been married by age 40. When you talk about like, why aren't men putting up today? Well, this would be part of fucking why. They aren't able to. They're disabled. They're drug addled. They don't have consistent work because blue collar employment is more precarious. What else do you want? Just tell them to go to therapy. That'll fix every fucking thing, right? God. Falls across the board, of course, but there's also a big class gap opening up. In 1980, which is not long ago by my lights, so that's when I was born, so it's kind of long ago for me, but I get it. Fewer than 1 in 10 working class men went up tied to Mott by 40. Now it's 1 in 3. Marriage has become a class good. It is not totally inaccessible for working class men, but it's getting harder and harder for them to do. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not a big proponent of the nuclear family and all that as a historical norm, because it's not. But this is bad. Right? And the gap in living with children is perhaps even more consequential. The share of working class men with children at home has dropped from 67% in 1980 to 51% in 2022. A much lower share than for other groups, making them the least likely to live with children. I don't live with children, but I get it. Share of men and women 30 to 50 years old with any kids in the household from 1980 to 1920 to 2002. We move up from under 80% of working class women to 69%, which also implies there's a lot of single working class mothers right now. That's what this implies. 64% of non-working class women, so 56% of non-working class men, down from about a little under 70%. This is where all this used to be. And then working class men used to be at 70%, and now it's all the way down to 51%. So we've seen precipitous drops, particularly for working class men. So for people who think that you need to abolish family, capitalism's already doing that for poor people already. It's just you replaced it with nothing good. As my friend Isabel Sawhill has written, family formation is a new fault line in the American class structure. A world where only half of the working class men are in a home with children is arguably a quite different one to the one where more than two-thirds are. The danger, as scholar Shelley Lumberg writes, is that we have too many men who are unburdened and unmoored. Well, that sounds conservative. Even I worry about it. It doesn't look like these men are filling the gaps with friendship either. Drawing the work from Daniel Kotz and AEI, who kindly supplied their data cut, we show a class gap in friendship. Oh, this is so fucking depressing. Share of men and women not having any close friends by their own reporting. Working class men, 21% have no close friends. Working class women, 19%. Non-working class men, 11%. Non-working class women, 8%. Loneliness is a public health concern, as everyone knows, thanks to the tireless work of the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. The two charts above suggest it's a general challenge, but especially for working class women and men. But note here that working class women are most likely to have children in their home. Together, the story is that working class men are the least likely to be married, the least likely to be living with children, and the least likely to have a close friend. And this is not good is hardly a new insight. As Crook says in Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, a guy needs somebody to be near him. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. And this is true. All right. A socialist are not to be promoting fucking atomization. Class ceilings. There are also plenty of material on perhaps better known challenges on the economic front, including a sharp decline in employment rates among working class men. And again, Marxist, I wouldn't consider people who can't get employment working class, but nonetheless. Prime age of employment by rate and sex were working class status. Non-working class men, 93% have employment. Non-working class women, 84% have employment. Working class men, 81% have employment. And that's in a low unemployment environment, people. We do not have high historical unemployment right now. And 83% of working class women, many of whom are staying home to take care of kids. Added to the age, which for working class men is basically the same as they were in 1979. Working class men's earning remains stagnant. All right. Median real weekly full-time earnings for men and women. Non-working class men on average about $15,050 a week. That has gone up from a little under $12,000 a week. Now that's not dealing with inflation, I don't think, and this is also between 1979 and 2003. So I would have actually expected it to go up more than that, but nonetheless. Non-working class women are still lower than non-working class men by a significant amount of money, about $400. But working class men are significantly under them at $852, which is stagnant to 1979. And that is not dealing with inflation. Basically, blue-collar men have seen no real increases in wages in over 44 years in the United States. If we mean blue-collar working class. Now, I'm not blue-collar working class, but this is unfucking acceptable. I come from this, and I see it in my life. I have brothers who are blue-collar working class. My stepfather and my father, well, my father was really kind of lumpenized, but they were both blue-collar working class. They did not have college degrees, despite the fact that my father lied about it in its well, it was lied about for him in his eulogy. Nonetheless, he did. That's probably too personal. I'm gonna leave it in there, but fuck, you guys don't know who my dad is anyway. Working class women have seen some increase in pay since 1979, but not as much as the other two groups. And again, the figure shows real weekly earning income for men and women of at least 25 years old. So we're not dealing with young people between 1979 and 1920 and 2003. Nominal earnings by education status were collected from the US BLS via FRED. Earnings were deflated using the PCI chain index. Okay, so there is some dealing with inflation. Okay, so this is adjusted for inflation. I take that back. Population counts for working class subgroups, less than high school, some college were collected by the CPS in order to produce the weighted averages for the median earnings for working class men and women. So associate's degree holders do seem to be considered working class in the study. We can get there later. Just because these facts might be reasonably well known in wonkier circles, however, does not make them any less important. I think they underpin that many of the other issues described in the paper. Time to respond to the alarms. The dominant narrative of gender equity is framed as almost exclusively in terms of the disadvantages of girls and women. But if we consider gender equity in the context of class, a different picture emerges. Especially at the bottom of the economic ladder, it is boys and men who are falling behind girls and women. Any serious effort to improve the weights of upper mobility or reduce economic inequity, like I would eliminate it entirely, but whatever. Perhaps to create an opportunity economy must take into account specific challenges being faced by boys and men. Otherwise, patterns of disadvantage will repeat across generations. This will be bad for everyone, including women and children, and especially boys. This will require more than a policy tweak here or a quick initiative there. These problems run deep and require a commensurate response. The good news is that there's clear connection between economic inequity and male malaise provides the possibility of bipartisan action. Yeah, but they're not going to do anything about it. You know that, Richard Reeves? Conservatives will be worried about boys and men need to be concerned about economic inequity. But liberals worried about inequity must pay more attention to boys and men. Perhaps class is primary in some of these discussions, even if race and gender are also important. They are important. You cannot reduce everything to just class, but class is primary here. And the gender divisions between classes are relatively different. We've seen efforts to help working class women, and it shows up in the stats. It's still not fucking good enough, not remotely good enough. And particularly when you add in the fact that women are often burdened with childcare in a way that men aren't, according to this paper. But if you don't deal with all of it, if you don't deal with all of society, if you only pick figures of who is morally deserving based on identity categories, this will continue to degenerate. And it will not end well. You want to protect your peace? Help everyone. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. Have a good day.